Get ready for a riveting ride from the very first line. This is the dramatic story of Tanya Tucker, a singer who catapulted to stardom as barely a teenager, shocked the world with her wild streak, battled addiction under the unforgiving glare of the public eye, faced heartbreak that made headlines, and then clawed her way back when most had written her off. She might have been the youngest breakout star in country music history, but she also became one of its most fascinating scandal magnets and ultimately an artist whose raw perseverance changed the conversation about what it meant to be a woman in the industry. Let's pull back the curtain and see how it all unfolded. Tanya Denise Tucker was born on October 10th, 1958, in Seminole, Texas, a small town with big horizons and an even bigger appetite for country music. Right from the start, it was obvious Tanya wasn't your typical child. Her voice had that gravelly, soul-soaked quality that felt strangely adult, even though she was just a kid learning to navigate life on dusty roads. Her father, Bo Tucker, spotted that gift early. He was convinced she was meant for greatness, and he didn't just encourage her. He made it his full-time mission to propel her into the spotlight. Tanya's childhood was unusual from the get-go. While her peers worried about who to sit next to at lunch, Tanya was already belting out songs at local fairs or talent shows. If there was a stage in the vicinity, Bo Tucker wanted his daughter on it, belting her heart out. By the time Tanya reached the age of 8, she was vocalizing to anyone who would listen that she planned to become a professional country singer. This wasn't some light-hearted child's fantasy. The conviction in her eyes was real, almost eerie. She had the raspy depth that made folks do a double take. How could such a little girl sound like a grown woman who'd lived 100 heartbreaks? Eager to find Tanya an opportunity that matched her enormous potential, Bo recorded a demo tape of her singing covers and shipped it off to as many Nashville executives as he could. The typical response from the music industry when an unsolicited child singer's tape landed on their desk was a swift toss into the bin. But luck, or maybe fate, intervened. Billy Sherrill, a producer known for his work with titans like Tammy Wynette and George Jones, gave that tape more than a passing glance. Intrigued by the uncommonly rich timbre in this kid's voice, he arranged for Tanya to come to Nashville to see if what he heard was genuine talent or just a fluke. It turned out to be the real deal. One of the first songs placed before Tanya was Delta Dawn, a tune that had been circulating but hadn't found its perfect match. It's a haunting piece about a woman drifting through her hometown, clinging to memories of a lost love. Normally, it would be considered far too heavy, thematically speaking, for a teenager. Yet once Tanya sang it, all bets were off. She delivered it with the emotional punch of someone who had been knocked around by life, even though she was barely in her teens. Everyone in the room felt it, that intangible quality you can't fake. Delta Dawn soared up the Billboard Hot Country Songs chart, hitting number 6 and launching Tanya Tucker as a phenomenon. People couldn't stop talking about how this tiny Texan teen had such a deeply resonant voice. But behind that breakthrough single, tensions and pressures were already mounting. Tanya was only 13, yet she was suddenly saddled with adult-sized responsibilities. Interviews, media appearances, demands for follow-up hits, and the scramble to figure out how to brand her image. Everything accelerated beyond belief. The industry is notorious for devouring child stars, and country music can be especially tough about it. Where other kids her age worried about math quizzes, Tanya was fielding questions on national TV, hurrying off to recording sessions, and traveling between venues for performances. The business machine wanted to replicate the success of Delta Dawn over and over, while Tanya herself hardly had time to catch her breath. It was exhilarating and suffocating all at once. To the outside world, Tanya looked unstoppable. She followed Delta Dawn with more hits, proving she wasn't a fluke. By the time she entered her mid-teens, she was stepping onto stages alongside established legends. She'd often be asked how she managed to sound so mature. Her best answer was simply that it came naturally. She wasn't consciously trying to impersonate older singers. She just sang as she felt. Yet as she edged closer to adulthood, she grew restless with the neat, sugar-coated image of a teenage country ingenue. Inside her was a rebellious streak, a refusal to be pigeonholed. This set her on a collision course with the conservative norms of the country music world. In 1978, she took a leap that shocked fans and critics alike. The album TNT. Its cover pictured a leather-clad Tanya, projecting a rock-charged attitude that made purists clutch their pearls. The music itself bore a gritty edge, more reminiscent of rock and southern rock influences than the sweet ballads she was known for. It might have alienated a few people who wanted her to remain the squeaky clean teenage star, but it also expanded her audience and reminded everyone that Tanya had an audacious sense of self, even if it scandalized some corners of the industry. Her flamboyant approach to image and music was only the tip of the iceberg. As she grew into adulthood, she became known for living large, fast cars, big houses, eye-catching outfits, and a no-apology swagger that set her apart from many female country artists of the time. Country audiences had grown accustomed to polished, modestly dressed singers, especially female ones. Tanya, on the other hand, was more than happy to appear in edgy photo shoots or give interviews where she swore, partied, and proclaimed she wasn't about to be tamed. It was only a matter of time before scandals began overshadowing her hits. She embraced a wild child persona that fascinated some and horrified others. But the real turning point in her life, the moment that catapulted Tanya Tucker from gossip fodder to a near train wreck, was her volatile relationship with country superstar Glen Campbell. He was around 2 decades older than Tanya, a household name with iconic hits under his belt. From the outside, it might have seemed like a match made in country music heaven, 2 high-profile artists, a media darling romance. But behind the scenes, it was more like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Glen was wrestling with his own demons, including addiction to cocaine, and Tanya, spirited as she was, got pulled in. She believed she could save him, or so the story goes, but ended up drowning in the same murky waters. Their affair was a magnet for tabloids. Paparazzi followed them everywhere, documenting their public blow-ups, their reconciliations, and their late-night party hopping. The press happily capitalized on every lurid detail. Tanya found herself in the crosshairs, criticized for living recklessly, for being with a man so much older, and for spiraling into drugs and chaotic behavior that threatened her career. Inside that romance, things were messy. Public spats turned into headline gold. Fans who once admired Tanya for her raw vocal power were shocked by stories of all-night benders, tearful arguments, and accusations of violence. While it's tempting to paint her as a victim, Tanya wasn't entirely passive in this. She was determined to live on her terms, and if that meant partying as hard as the big boys, she was going to do it. Eventually, though, she paid a steep price. Addiction sank its teeth into her, warping her daily routine and sapping the discipline that had driven her success. She began missing shows or showing up in no condition to sing. Record labels that once saw her as a cash cow started worrying that she was too unstable, too unpredictable. Meanwhile, new stars were emerging. Reba McEntire, George Strait, Randy Travis opening a fresh chapter in country music that drew attention away from Tanya's meltdown. The flame that burned so bright had begun to flicker, overshadowed by the tabloids chronicling her downward spiral. By the late 1980s, Tanya Tucker's career looked like it was headed for a tragic ending. The child prodigy turned rebellious superstar seemed poised to become another cautionary tale of talent, destroyed by reckless living. The synergy of heartbreak, addiction, and relentless media glare was unstoppable. People who'd once championed her either distanced themselves or moved on, figuring she'd never recapture her former glory. Then something changed. Tanya, facing the serious threat of losing everything, decided she wasn't going down without a fight. She checked herself into rehab, stepping away from the glare of the cameras and focusing on the daunting process of getting clean. Rehab wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy for someone who'd spent almost her entire life in front of a microphone. Yet during this time, Tanya confronted the heartbreak of her relationship with Glenn, the regrets over missed gigs and lost fans, and the humiliation of seeing her scandalous behavior plastered everywhere. She also started figuring out who she was without the party lifestyle and relentless schedule she'd always had. That kind of introspection forced her to look back at how quickly she'd been thrust into an adult world and how ill-prepared she'd been to navigate its traps and vices. When she emerged, she was determined to clean up not just her health, but her career as well. In the early 1990s, she released the album Tanya, signaling a kind of rebirth. It was a statement that she was back, healthier, and ready to reclaim her spot. One of the standout tracks, Two Sparrows in a Hurricane, was an ode to endurance, resonating with fans who felt Tanya was singing about her own survival. Critics, who might have been skeptical about her return, had to acknowledge that her voice was as powerful as ever, laced now with the wisdom of someone who'd actually lived through heartbreak and self-destruction. During this comeback, she faced a new wave of competition from artists who were riding the crest of the pop country crossover. Yet she managed to stay relevant, partly because her name and story were already embedded in country music lore, and partly because she continued to demonstrate her artistry. She might have lost the innocence and novelty of her teenage stardom, but she gained a depth that made her music hit even harder. Fans watched her belt out her ballads on stage, hearing echoes of the storms she'd weathered, and felt a renewed connection. Still, scandal wasn't done with Tanya. Legal fights began popping up, including lawsuits from previous managers alleging unpaid commissions. Meanwhile, questionable financial decisions from her wilder days had stacked up, creating significant debt. By the early 90s, she was staring down the possibility of bankruptcy. The lavish lifestyle, cars, clothing, endless nights of excess had left a dent in her bank accounts. This period forced Tanya to become more pragmatic, focusing on touring not just for the artistic high, but also to stay afloat financially. She had no choice but to hustle. Remarkably, that hustle further fueled her renaissance. She started paying off debts and rebuilding her reputation as a reliable performer. Her songs once again peppered the charts, if not always at the top, at least proving she was a force to be reckoned with. By the time the decade drew to a close, Tanya Tucker had consolidated her status as someone who wouldn't quit, no matter how many times the public expected her to fade away. As the 2000s unfolded, Tanya's name receded somewhat from mainstream attention. She still performed and recorded, but the industry spotlight had migrated to younger acts. It seemed like she might permanently remain a beloved relic from a previous era, a sort of cautionary hero, if you will, recognized for her classic hits and tumultuous life story, but not exactly a chart threat. Then in 2019, her trajectory took another surprising turn. A new generation of artists, many of whom had grown up idolizing her fearlessness, approached her with the idea of recording an album that showcased her raw talents without the frills and artifice. Brandi Carlile and Shooter Jennings collaborated with Tanya on While I'm Livin', an album that stripped down the production and put her voice right up front. Critics called it a revelation, praising the authenticity that radiated from every track. Fans, whether they remembered her from the Delta Dawn days or had only discovered her through name-dropping by younger stars, embraced the album wholeheartedly. But the real bombshell came in 2020 when While I'm Livin' snagged the Grammy for Best Country Album, and Bring My Flowers Now won for Best Country Song. These trophies were Tanya's first Grammys. Stunningly, she'd been nominated 14 times in the past without taking one home. She stepped up to the mic during the award ceremony, acknowledging her teenage nomination decades ago and the winding road that brought her to this moment. The child star turned scandal-ridden wild child turned survivor was now a Grammy winner, recognized at the highest level. It was a sweet triumph for someone who had been publicly dismissed more than once. Of course, controversies and headlines about her personal life still dot the internet. People continue to debate whether her rebellious image was contrived or genuine, whether she truly overcame all her demons or simply learned to hide them better. Yet the reality is that scandal shaped Tanya Tucker into one of the most distinctive and captivating figures in country music. Unlike many who let controversies annihilate their careers, she harnessed them, albeit painfully, and used the momentum to reinvent herself time after time. Her legacy, boiled down, is that she expanded the boundaries for women in country, especially those who didn't fit the pristine mold. She dealt head-on with addiction, messy relationships, and financial woes in the public eye. And, crucially, she never allowed any single failure to define her. Instead of being permanently labeled a cautionary tale, she became an embodiment of grit and survival. Many of today's country stars cite her as an influence not just musically, but for her sheer nerve in facing adversity. Now, every time Tanya steps on stage, there's a sense of awe. People recall the teenage girl who pulled off Delta Dawn at 13, the tabloid firebrand who seemed on a collision course with oblivion, and the middle-aged artist who clawed her way back into the spotlight. Her voice remained strong, laced with the kind of emotional resonance only a life full of battles can produce. She might not dominate the charts as she once did, but her story continues to fascinate, reminding fans that redemption is always possible. One of the biggest lessons from Tanya's journey is that being a trailblazer often means facing heavy backlash. In the realm of country music, a genre steeped in tradition, she was perpetually coloring outside the lines, whether by wearing leather and singing rock-inflected tunes, or by publicly dating older men, or by living so openly that the tabloids were never short on fodder. But that same outspokenness also endeared her to people who were tired of seeing women forced into a neat, docile image just to appease audiences. She carved out space for authenticity, no matter how messy it got. Her relationship with Glenn Campbell in particular left a scar that shaped her perspective for years to come. She's openly talked about the heartbreak and regrets, the nights lost to drugs, and the sense of betrayal, both from him and from the prying eyes of the media. Yet she's also said it was a learning experience, one that taught her the harsh realities of love in the limelight and the dangers of tying your sense of self-worth to another person's stability. It's sobering to think how close she came to letting that relationship define her ending, instead of fueling her comeback. Beyond that infamous romance, she had plenty of other rumored affairs, short-lived flings, and drama-laden feuds with other artists. Some were true, some were likely embellished by gossip magazines, but they all added to the air of unpredictability surrounding her. She was never the safe bet, never the star who would toe the line politely. It's precisely why she remained fascinating for so many decades. Even when her hits cooled, the story of Tanya Tucker never quite did. Her battles with addiction also served as a cautionary tale. Too much fame, too soon, with too little protection, can be a recipe for disaster. She recognized that later in life, expressing a sort of bittersweet reflection about how she'd grown up under constant scrutiny. When she was on the upswing, the media loved her to bits. When she stumbled, they circled her like vultures. Having your teenage years and early 20s dissected in public could warp anyone's sense of self, but she used that ordeal to become a formidable force in an industry that doesn't always have room for second chances. Financial mismanagement, too, haunted her, culminating in lawsuits and near bankruptcy. Where some stars might quietly settle their debts and avoid the public eye, Tanya had to do it under the unrelenting glare of cameras. Tabloids reveled in the storyline, the formerly well-heeled star forced to scramble for money. This period tested her fortitude all over again. If she wanted to rebound, she had to tour extensively, night after night, to pull herself out of the hole. And she did. Each show became a statement that she wasn't finished, that she could stand before an audience and deliver a performance worth every penny, no matter what the headline said. By the late 90s, Tanya found herself in a more stable place. She'd survived addiction, heartbreak, and near financial ruin. She wasn't always splashed across the front page anymore, but she maintained a loyal fan base and a decent position in the country scene. Her hits had slowed, but she never truly vanished. Then when the 2010s ended, the album While I'm Livin' not only introduced a new generation to her remarkable range, but also reminded the old guard that Tanya Tucker was still a creative powerhouse. That Grammy moment in 2020 wasn't just about industry recognition. It was about vindication. After decades of being nominated, lauded, criticized, and caricatured, she finally got the prize trophy. She joked about it on stage, recalling how she'd first been nominated at 14 and had gone home empty-handed each time since. Now, older, wiser, but still full of spunk, she held the gold in her hands. It was proof that her story wasn't done, and that all those tabloid narratives of a meltdown didn't get the last word. It's interesting to note that even after hitting that milestone, Tanya never fully shed her rebellious side. She's still known to speak her mind about the state of modern country or to push boundaries if she feels like it. Some traditions never die, and her defiant spark is certainly among them. And while she's not racking up weekly controversies like in her wilder days, the fascination endures. Audiences see an artist who has triumphed over adversity so many times that she's practically bulletproof. Summarizing her legacy is simple. Tanya Tucker refused to let scandal destroy her. She leveraged her mistakes, heartbreaks, and controversies to deepen her artistry, bridging the gap between raw country storytelling and a rock and roll attitude that was practically unheard of among female stars of her era. She influenced a slew of younger female artists who learned from her that you can break molds, survive the aftermath, and emerge stronger for it. So if Tanya's tumultuous odyssey inspires you, if you see the echoes of your own struggles in her story of meteoric rise, painful crashes, and dogged comebacks, make sure to show some love. Hit that like button, drop a comment about your favorite Tanya Tucker moment or song, and subscribe for more deep dives into the icons who rewrote the rules of country music. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that no matter how bad the scandal, how deep the addiction, or how crippling the heartbreak, there's always a chance to come back swinging. Tanya Tucker didn't just survive the storms, she turned them into thunderous applause. And in a world that loves to count people out, that may be the most powerful scandal of all.